Brenda laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound that cut through the silent restaurant. Her hand, adorned with the ring I'd bought, rested on another man's thigh, just visible beneath the tablecloth. My chest felt hollow. A concrete block dropped where my heart used to be. Honestly, Frank, she said, her eyes flicking to mine, you're just not man enough for me. The highway hummed beneath the tires of Frank Miller's Ford, a monotonous drone that matched the dull ache in his chest. At 44, a mechanical design engineer, he was driving toward a new town, a place he hoped would offer more than just a different view from a different office window. The sky over rural Ohio was a flat, uninteresting gray, much like the decade he'd spent at Carlson Industries. 10 years he'd given them, building their products, their reputation, while his own life at home had slowly, steadily eroded into something he barely recognized, something he'd certainly grown to despise. This drive wasn't just about a career change. It was the first critical move in a plan he'd been carefully constructing for months, a blueprint more intricate than any he'd ever drawn for Carlson. This scheme, cold and precise, aimed to finally, irrevocably, rid himself of Brenda Peterson, his wife, his cheating wife. The phrase tasted bitter, like cheap coffee left too long on the burner. His thoughts drifted back, as they often did these days, to the beginning. Kingston University, nearly 20 years ago. He'd seen Brenda across a crowded lecture hall, her head tilted, laughing at something a friend had said. She radiated an easy confidence, a bright energy that had drawn his shy, awkward self in like a moth to a flame. He'd always been the quiet one, the boy who watched rather than participated. Growing up, his mother had been a force, bossy and opinionated, always telling him how things should be. His older sisters, Martha and Darlene, had used him as their personal punching bag, quick to remind him that their father had left because of him, because he was born. Brenda, with her bright eyes and ready smile, had been everything his past wasn't. He parked the Ford in the lot of Midwest Innovations, a low, modern building just off the interstate. The air carried the scent of freshly cut grass and distant exhaust fumes. Dale Anderson, the owner, met him at the reception desk. Dale, a man a few years older than Frank, with an easy handshake and direct gaze, had once been a competitor. Frank had always heard good things about him, about his honesty in a business notoriously short on it. That integrity was something Frank found immediately striking, a rare quality. They sat in Dale's office, the window looking out over a small, well-maintained patch of lawn. Frank laid out his proposal, audacious and unvarnished. I know Carlson's operations, Dale, he began, his voice steady. I know their contracts. I know where they cut corners, and I know where they could be doing better. I also know my designs are superior. He explained a commission structure based not just on his salary, but on the new business he could bring in, directly leveraging his insider knowledge, his decade of loyalty now weaponized. Dale listened, leaning back in his chair, his expression unreadable. He asked a few sharp questions, then nodded slowly. It's a bold move, Frank, he said, a faint smile touching his lips. But I appreciate the directness, and I believe you. He extended his hand across the polished desk. Welcome aboard. Frank felt a quiet, contained surge of triumph. The handshake was firm, a tangible connection to a new future. Another part of the plan was accomplished. This job, this new start, was a cornerstone. It provided the financial and geographical distance he needed. His mind, however, immediately circled back to Brenda. Even before they were married, when they were still at Kingston, rumors had started. Whispers, casual observations from mutual friends, always dismissed by Brenda with a laugh or a plausible explanation. Oh, he's just a friend, Frank. You know how people talk. He wanted to believe her, wanted it more than anything. He'd never felt such a profound, consuming love, a feeling that eclipsed the coldness of his childhood, the loneliness that had shadowed him for so long. He'd ignored his friend's warnings, pushed down his own creeping suspicions. He had needed to believe her. They married, eventually settling in a comfortable 4-bedroom house near Southampton, close to Brenda's family. Laura and Grace came along, two bright, inquisitive girls who filled the house with noise and laughter. For years, life seemed, on the surface, great. Frank got promotions, they bought a bigger car, went on family vacations. He'd built a life, a seemingly perfect Midwestern dream. And all the while, the rot had been setting in, slow and deliberate, just out of his direct sight. The year 2008 arrived like a cold front, settling over the Midwest with an economic chill. At Carlson Industries, the workload increased while job security dwindled. Frank, a mechanical design engineer, found himself putting in longer hours, sacrificing evenings and weekends, often without any extra pay. The company needed him. His designs were crucial, but the gratitude felt thin, a fragile shield against the rising tide of stress. He'd arrive home exhausted, his mind still cycling through schematics, only to find the house quiet, Brenda out. It was during these strained months, when the weight of the market downturn pressed down on everyone, that the creeping certainty about Brenda hardened into solid fact. She started carrying her phone everywhere, often face down. Her stories about her whereabouts became more vague, punctuated by a forced cheerfulness that didn't quite reach her eyes. He noticed a new scent on her clothes, something floral and unfamiliar, distinct from her usual perfume. It wasn't a single dramatic revelation, but a series of small, accumulating details that painted an undeniable picture. He suspected it was someone from her university days, a ghost from their shared past, but he never pressed for a name, never wanted to give her the satisfaction of a full confession he knew she wouldn't offer. One evening after she'd arrived home late, her breath carrying the faint aroma of red wine, he finally spoke. "Brenda," he began, his voice flat, "are you seeing someone else?" She laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound that grated on his ears. "Frank, honestly, you're being ridiculous. It was just Sarah. We went out for a drink." Her gaze darted past his shoulder, refusing to meet his eyes. "You're stressed from work. You're imagining things." He watched her closely, the way her fingers fidgeted with her necklace, the slight stiffness in her posture. He knew, with a dull, heavy certainty, that she was lying. His gut twisted, a cold knot forming where warmth used to be. Despite the unspoken fracture in their marriage, Frank's salary remained substantial. Brenda, ever conscious of appearances, had pushed for a bigger house, a more suitable address in a better school district. A house with more square footage, more granite countertops, more space for a life that was increasingly empty. He'd signed the papers, watched her pick out new furniture, the whole charade playing out as if nothing was wrong. The large, well-manicured lawn became another obligation, another layer of polish on a life that was chipping away underneath. That same year, a quiet, almost imperceptible shift occurred within Frank. An instinct for self-preservation, dormant for years, began to stir. He opened a new savings account, not at their usual bank, but at a smaller branch across town, one he'd never used before. He channeled his year-end bonuses, substantial sums from Carlson, into this secret fund. Brenda had always been oblivious to the specifics of their finances, content to let him handle the bills as long as the lifestyle was maintained. He knew she would never find it. The act felt like a quiet rebellion, a reclaiming of control. This secret fund became his protection, not a fund for a new car or a lavish vacation, but a quiet safeguard against the uncertain future he now knew was inevitable. It was a tangible act of independence, a stark contrast to the emotional dependence he'd shown Brenda for so long. Every deposit was a small brick in a wall he was building around himself, a silent declaration that he would not be left exposed again. Life, to an outsider, might have seemed to return to normal. The rhythms of work and home resumed. But for Frank, a new priority had emerged, solid and unwavering. His daughters, Laura and Grace, they were his anchor, his reason to keep moving. Weekends became their time, sacred and inviolable. He drove them to Laura's ballet classes, sat on cold bleachers at Grace's soccer games, helped them with homework, took them to the park or the library. Their laughter, their uncomplicated affection, were the only genuine joys he allowed himself. Brenda, conversely, seemed to retreat further into her own world. Her coffee dates and time with her lazy friends, his quiet internal label for her social circle, took precedence. She'd offer vague explanations. "Oh, I just need some me time, Frank," or "The girls are fine with you. You're so good with them." Her disinterest in family time was palpable, a chilling absence that the girls thankfully seemed too young to fully grasp. Friends and colleagues, well-meaning but often clumsy, began to make comments. "Brenda's got you on a short leash, huh, Frank?" Someone would joke at a company picnic, a smile that didn't quite reach their eyes. Or, "Don't tell Brenda I said this, but you always seem to be doing what she wants." He'd force a smile, a non-committal shrug, but the words burrowed deep. He felt like a dog on a chain, constantly pulled by her desires, his own life shrinking. He'd cancel plans for a poker night or a fishing trip, a quiet "Brenda needs me" as his excuse, each concession fueling a quiet, slow-burning resentment that he carefully kept hidden beneath a placid surface. Years folded into one another, carrying the girls from childhood into young womanhood. Laura, his eldest, went off to Kingston University, their old alma mater, chasing a future Frank hoped would be brighter than his own past. 2 years later, Grace followed, the quiet one, the observer, mirroring her sister's path. Frank drove Grace to Kingston, helping her move into the shared apartment she'd secured with Laura. The air in the small, sunlit living room was thick with the dust of new beginnings and old memories. They worked in comfortable silence, unpacking boxes, arranging books, and hanging posters. Then, as Frank knelt to unpack a bundle of Grace's clothes, she spoke, her voice softer than usual, but with an edge he hadn't heard before. "Daddy," she said, her voice barely a whisper, yet it cut through the quiet like glass. He looked up to see her standing in the doorway to her new bedroom, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Her eyes, usually so calm, were glistening, a sheen of unshed tears making them seem impossibly large. I, I heard something." She paused, took a shallow breath. "I heard she's hanging around with Chad Carlson at your company." The words landed in the room with the weight of lead. Frank froze, a shirt half unfolded in his hands. He felt a sickening lurch in his gut, a confirmation of a truth he'd always known but never allowed himself to voice. Chad Carlson. The name echoed, cold and distant. Hank Carlson's nephew, the owner of Carlson Industries. A man he saw in the hallways, at company functions. A man whose easy smile now felt like a sneer. Stunned, yes, but not surprised. The revelation wasn't a shock, but a final damning piece of evidence, fitting perfectly into the puzzle of Brenda's lies and evasions. The affair from years ago, the one he'd buried under layers of denial, now had a name, a face, a brutal, undeniable reality. He thought of his past in action, the years he'd spent in silent complicity. His fear had been a heavy blanket, smothering his instincts. The fear of breaking up the family, of inflicting on his daughters the same pain his own sisters, Martha and Darlene, had suffered. The lingering resentment they still held against their father for leaving. He'd told himself he was protecting them, but Grace's tears, her quiet accusation, revealed a deeper truth. His girl's hostility towards Brenda, a subtle current he'd often dismissed as teenage moodiness, was far more profound than he'd imagined. They weren't just annoyed by her, they were disappointed in him, in his passivity. They saw his weakness, his refusal to confront the obvious. Grace's words, so quiet, so filled with a sorrow that mirrored his own, ignited old, suppressed feelings. It brought back the echoes of his childhood, the constant pressure from his bossy mother, the bullying from his sisters, the endless accusations that he was the reason their father left. He'd always been the quiet one, the one who tried to keep the peace, the one who folded under the pressure of dominant women. He had spent his whole life trying to avoid confrontation, only to realize he'd merely postponed it, making the inevitable blow even harder. A colder, harder realization settled in. Employees at Carlson Industries. Of course, they must have known. The whispered conversations, the knowing glances, the abrupt silences when he walked into a room. He hadn't been imagining it. They weren't just talking about Brenda, they were mocking him. And Chad Carlson, the man who had cuckolded him, the nephew of his boss, probably walked around with an air of smug superiority, his secret and open joke among his colleagues. The thought, the image of their faces twisted Frank's stomach. He had allowed himself to be made a fool of, not just in his own home, but in his professional life, in the very place he sought his sense of worth. No, he could not take it any longer. Grace's discovery, her quiet, heartbroken plea, meant he finally had to stand up. Not just for himself, but for his daughters, for the semblance of respect he still clung to. The meticulous plan he'd been crafting, the new job, the secret savings, It all coalesced into a fierce, unwavering resolve. He drove back home to Southampton, the hum of the highway now a furious thrum in his ears. The house felt like a powder keg. His heart pounded with a rhythm he hadn't felt in years, a mixture of fear and something akin to a desperate, uncoiling rage. He walked into the quiet kitchen, the fluorescent lights humming, casting a sterile glow on the clean, empty table. This table, where they had shared family dinners, now felt like a silent battleground. He sat down, waiting. The garage door rumbled. Footsteps on the tiled entryway, the jingle of keys. Brenda walked in, her face an unreadable mask, an expression he'd come to recognize as apathy mixed with a quiet contempt. She didn't look at him, didn't offer a greeting. Silently, she placed her purse and shopping bags on the counter, beginning to unload groceries. The mundane actions only amplified the tension, turning the ordinary into something brittle, ready to shatter. The sound of Brenda rustling plastic grocery bags filled the tense quiet of the kitchen. Frank watched her, his hands clasped tightly on the cool Formica tabletop. He felt the tremor starting in his fingers, spreading quickly through his arms, then his chest. His throat felt dry, constricted. He took a breath, the air tasting stale. "Are you having an affair, Brenda?" The words came out, barely a whisper, yet loud in the silent room. His voice, usually steady, cracked, betraying the raw edge of fear and hurt that clawed at him. Brenda paused, a carton of milk in her hand. She turned slowly, her gaze finally meeting his. A faint blush crept up her neck, staining her cheeks a pale rose. It wasn't a blush of shame, he realized with a cold dread, but something closer to annoyance, or perhaps a perverse kind of pride. She held his gaze for a moment, then smiled faintly, a tight, thin curve of her lips. "An affair?" she said, her voice even, almost amused. She placed the milk in the refrigerator, then closed the door with a soft click. "I wouldn't call it a novel, darling." Frank felt the blood drain from his face. The audacity of her response stole his breath, leaving him gasping silently. Not a novel, as if it were a mere chapter, a passing diversion, inconsequential. He could only stare, his mind reeling, waiting for an explanation that he knew deep down would only twist the knife further. He waited for her to deny it, to rage, to cry, to do anything but this calm, almost casual admission. She leaned back against the counter, crossing her arms, her posture relaxed, as if discussing the weather. "You're a wonderful person, Frank," she began, her tone almost conciliatory, but there was a sharp, hard edge beneath the surface. "A great provider. You've given me a beautiful home, beautiful daughters." She paused, her eyes sweeping over the immaculate kitchen, then back to him. "But there are things you can't provide for me. And I'm not ashamed to say I want all of it." His jaw tightened. The words hung in the air, a cruel, blunt instrument. "Things you can't provide for me." The unspoken accusation was clear, tearing at his already fragile sense of self. He felt his face flush, a sudden heat rising from his collar. "So," he managed, his voice barely audible, "you're cheating on me?" He needed to hear it, stark and undeniable, even though every fiber of his being recoiled from it. Brenda sighed, a sound of mild exasperation. "Only my body, Frank, not my heart or my mind. Those belong to you." His head swam, the room tilted. Only her body. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of the statement left him speechless, his stomach knotting into a tight, hard ball. He wanted to shout, to rage, to smash something, but his voice was trapped, choked by the bile rising in his throat. This wasn't some romantic notion of separate physical and emotional connections. This was a calculated, cold-blooded dismissal of their vows, of him. Then she dropped another bomb. She pushed off the counter, walking over to the pantry. "I've never turned you down for sex, Frank. You know that." She pulled out a bag of chips, tearing it open with a loud rip that echoed in the silence. "And all I do is explore with a couple of young guys." She crunched a chip loudly, her gaze unwavering. "What?" The word exploded from Frank, louder than he intended, a guttural cry of disbelief and pure, unadulterated shock. He hadn't meant to shout, he was never one to raise his voice, and the sound surprised even himself. It startled Brenda, too. She flinched, her eyes widening slightly, a flicker of something like surprise crossing her face before it was quickly masked. A couple of young guys, not just Chad Carlson, not just one isolated, regrettable mistake. This was a pattern, a lifestyle. Her casual dismissal of his pain, her open admission of multiple partners, her lack of any discernible remorse, it pushed him past any breaking point he might have had left. The betrayal wasn't a crack, it was a chasm, opening beneath his feet. Her infidelity wasn't just physical, it was deeper, wider, and more disrespectful than he had ever in his darkest imaginings conceived. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw a stranger, a woman utterly devoid of empathy for the man she had promised to cherish. The sound of Brenda munching chips, oblivious to the seismic shift she had just caused, echoed in the kitchen. Frank stood there, numb, the word "what" still hanging in the air. His body trembled, a raw tremor of shock and disbelief. But as the initial wave of gut-wrenching pain receded, something cold and hard began to settle in its place. A new clarity. The fog of denial and hope, which he'd clung to for years, finally lifted, revealing the stark, desolate landscape of his marriage. His mind, trained in engineering and problem-solving, clicked into a grim, methodical gear. He began his research with a quiet intensity, late at night, long after Brenda had gone to bed. Divorce laws, asset division, child custody. The legal jargon filled his laptop screen, each phrase a brick in the wall he was building. He meticulously planned every step, every contingency, a blueprint for retribution. The years of Brenda's neglect, her ceaseless financial demands, the way she had bled him dry emotionally and financially, all culminated in this brazen confession. There was no turning back. She had pushed him past the point of no return. Frank began to distance himself from Brenda, not with anger or confrontation, but with a quiet, almost imperceptible emotional retreat. He became a ghost in his own home, moving through the days with a calm, detached exterior. He nodded at her pronouncements, offered non-committal hums to her stories, and met her eyes with an unnerving blankness. Brenda, in her self-absorption, seemed to misinterpret his newfound calm as acceptance, perhaps even a sign of his weakness, a concession to her way of life. Let her think that, he thought. It was part of the plan. His secret savings, the clandestine fund he had started years ago, became his war chest. He quietly consolidated it, ensuring every penny was untouchable, liquid, ready for the impending battle. It was more than just money. It was freedom, leverage, a tangible expression of his independence. Each deposit, each transfer, felt like a silent act of rebellion. Subtly, he started gathering evidence. He noted dates and times when Brenda claimed to be with her friends, cross-referencing them with her vague recollections. He paid closer attention to her phone, the quick glances she gave it, the way she would sometimes leave it face down. He listened for names, any clues related to her explorations, or more specifically, to Chad Carlson. He trained himself to observe without reacting, to collect data dispassionately, like an engineer analyzing stress points in a bridge. At Midwest Innovations, Frank continued to excel. The focus on his work was a welcome distraction, a place where his intelligence and diligence were valued. He deepened his professional ties with Dale Anderson, learning the intricacies of the business, gaining invaluable industry insights. He made strategic moves quietly, deliberately, to undermine Carlson Industries. He used his insider knowledge, the very expertise Carlson had benefited from for a decade, to win away key contracts, to outmaneuver them in bids. Each success, each contract secured, was a small, satisfying victory, a precursor to the larger war he was preparing for. He also became more present, more engaged with Laura and Grace. He listened to their stories from university, offered advice, and simply spent time with them. He fostered their trust, drawing them closer to him without ever speaking ill of Brenda. He didn't need to. Their own observations had already painted a clear picture. He wanted them to see him, truly see him, as a steady, reliable presence, not the passive man they had once judged. He was building his own support system, a foundation of love that Brenda's treachery could never touch. Brenda's condescension continued, her dismissals sharper, her self-satisfaction more pronounced. "You're getting so quiet, Frank," she'd say, a hint of disdain in her voice. Or, "Don't look so glum, darling. Lighten up a little." He endured it all, letting her words wash over him, each one a drop of fuel added to the burning determination within him. He understood now that to pay the price wasn't just about financial ruin for her. It was about exposing her true character, stripping away the comfortable, self-deceived existence she had built for herself. It was about making her face the consequences of her choices, not just in a court of law, but in the court of public opinion, in the eyes of their daughters. For a man who had spent a lifetime avoiding confrontation, Frank Miller was now meticulously crafting a plan that would shatter his world, and hers, into a million pieces. You've followed Frank's journey this far, watching the slow burn of his resentment turn into a calculated fury. Stick around to the end to see how life's costly choices unfold. At Midwest Innovations, Frank's work was a stark counterpoint to the quiet decay of his home life. His strategic insights, born from a decade inside Carlson Industries, were proving invaluable. His new designs, coupled with his intimate knowledge of their competitors' weaknesses, began to significantly impact Carlson Industries' market share. He watched their numbers dip, their market reports show a decline, and felt a cold, quiet satisfaction. Each lost contract for Carlson was a small, almost imperceptible victory for Frank, a silent declaration of his new purpose. He maintained a cordial but distant relationship with Brenda. They lived parallel lives under the same roof. He'd say good morning and her, "How was your day?" with a neutral tone devoid of emotion. He avoided any topic that might lead to argument, any hint of conflict. This carefully constructed emotional distance further pacified her suspicions. Brenda, absorbed in her own world, seemed to view his quietude as capitulation, perhaps even relief that he wasn't rocking the boat. She took his placid demeanor for granted, seeing it as confirmation of his inherent meekness. His true focus remained on Laura and Grace. He spent increasing quality time with them, becoming their steadfast confidant and anchor. He listened more than he spoke, offering practical advice and unwavering support. They in turn began to confide in him more, their frustration with Brenda's self-absorption growing more evident. "Mom just doesn't seem to care," Laura might say, after Brenda canceled plans for a family dinner. Grace, ever the quieter observer, would simply sigh, her eyes conveying volumes. Frank never directly criticized Brenda, but he nurtured their trust, building a solid bridge between himself and his daughters, one sturdy enough to weather the storm to come. Through his expanding network at Midwest Innovations, Frank began to gather more information about Chad Carlson. Industry contacts, unaware of Frank's personal vendetta, would casually mention Chad's habits, his personal life, his professional vulnerabilities. Frank filed it all away, a quiet database of useful intelligence. He learned about Chad's debts, his taste for expensive toys, his casual disregard for company policy when it suited him. Information was power, and Frank intended to wield it. Brenda, meanwhile, remained oblivious. Her casual affairs continued, growing more brazen. She'd leave later, return later, her explanations more flimsy, her affect more dismissive. She seemed to genuinely believe Frank was either too meek, too grateful for the life he provided, or too emotionally crippled to ever challenge her. This miscalculation on her part only fueled his resolve. He watched, he listened, he documented. He meticulously recorded all financial transactions. He reviewed joint assets, noting every significant purchase Brenda made, every lavish expenditure. He compiled a detailed ledger of her spending habits, a damning portrait of her disregard for their shared finances. This wasn't just about preparing for a legal battle. It was about laying bare the extent of her self-indulgence, the weight of her demands on his own hard-earned money. His best friend, Jim Harper, a man who had known Frank since college, began to notice the shift. "You seem different, Frank," Jim observed one afternoon over coffee. "Stronger, like you've finally found your backbone." There was a quiet strength about Frank now, a steely resolve that replaced his former subservience. Jim, sensing a deeper shift than Frank was ready to articulate, offered his unwavering support. "Whatever's going on," Jim said, his hand resting briefly on Frank's arm, "I'm here. You know that." It was a quiet reassurance, a comfort in the gathering storm. Frank discreetly consulted with a lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Sarah Jensen. He laid out his situation in a calm, factual manner, presenting his meticulously gathered evidence. Sarah listened, her expression neutral, occasionally scribbling notes. She outlined the legal landscape, the complexities of asset division, and child custody battles. Together, they refined his strategy for maximum impact and minimal personal loss. Frank learned the nuances of marital law, the leverage points, the critical evidence needed. He was preparing for a war and he intended to win. He also began to subtly steer conversations with his daughters. He'd talk about integrity, about respect for oneself and others, about the inevitable consequences of choices. He never explicitly mentioned Brenda, but the themes were clear, preparing them gently for the inevitable revelation. He wanted them to understand, to see the truth when it finally emerged, not as a sudden, brutal shock, but as the painful culmination of years of deception. Finally, Frank ensured his new home was secured, his financial independence firmly established. He purchased a smaller, more practical house in the new town, not too far from Kingston, a place where he could build a stable future for himself and, crucially, for his daughters. Every piece was falling into place, every move calculated. The stage was set. The ripple effects of Frank's work at Midwest Innovations were becoming a palpable tremor at Carlson Industries. His strategic insights, the very ones he had cultivated during his decade there, were now being wielded against them with surgical precision. Major contracts, once considered secure, began to slip away. The financial strain mounted, causing internal turmoil. Whispers of layoffs, of tightening belts, started circulating through the industry. Frank watched from his new vantage point, a quiet satisfaction settling in his chest. Chad Carlson, in particular, was feeling the heat. His projects, once given preferential treatment by his uncle, were now under increased scrutiny. Frank made sure of it, subtly feeding information about Chad's shortcomings and professional misjudgments to mutual contacts who would then, inevitably, voice concerns to Hank Carlson. Chad's reputation, once shielded by nepotism, began to fray. He was becoming a vulnerable target, precisely as Frank intended. Brenda, ever slow to perceive reality beyond her own desires, started to notice the subtle shift. The household budget, once limitless, felt a little tighter. Frank's attention, once constant and available, was now a scarce resource. She felt the pinch of her diminished control over the finances. Though she still didn't connect it to Frank's deliberate actions. She would complain about the cost of things, blame the economy, but the true depth of Frank's plan remained opaque to her. It was a slow, controlled tightening of the noose. Laura and Grace, meanwhile, continued their quiet observations. Their concern over Brenda's lifestyle morphed into palpable disappointment. Her disinterest in their lives, her increasingly erratic behavior, her constant preoccupation with her own social calendar, it all chipped away at any remaining respect they had for her. They confided more and more in Frank, turning to him for stability, for an ear that truly listened. "Mom just doesn't seem to get it, Dad," Laura said one evening, frustration clear in her voice. "She thinks everything is fine as long as she's having fun." Frank simply listened, offering a calm, steady presence. With Sarah Jensen's guidance, Frank initiated the preliminary legal steps for separation. The timing was crucial, carefully orchestrated to coincide with a major blow to Carlson Industries, a large government contract Frank had systematically derailed. The legal papers, prepared with surgical precision, were another piece of the intricate puzzle. He ensured his daughters were emotionally prepared. He didn't drop bombshells, but he gently discussed the idea of change, of new beginnings, of how sometimes difficult decisions were necessary for long-term happiness. He reinforced his commitment to them, promising them a stable, supportive environment, a refuge from Brenda's chaotic influence. He spent more time in his new house, gradually moving essentials, making it a home, a sanctuary ready for them. Frank then confronted Chad Carlson, not directly, but through the carefully crafted channels of industry gossip and strategic leaks. He shared damaging information about Chad's professional incompetence, his questionable decision-making on past projects, his tendency to blame others for his failures. This information, while entirely separate from the affair, served to further erode Chad's standing, making him appear unreliable and untrustworthy in the eyes of his uncle and other key figures. The goal was to dismantle Chad's professional life, leaving him with little to protect, little to distract him from his own personal unraveling. As Frank's independence grew more apparent, Brenda's social circle began to shrink. Her friends, a transient group of like-minded individuals, started to distance themselves. They noticed her increasingly erratic behavior, the desperate edge in her voice when she complained about money, the way Frank seemed to have quietly slipped out from under her thumb. Isolation began to set in, a consequence of her own actions. One evening, Frank delivered his quiet ultimatum. Brenda was in the kitchen, casually scrolling through her phone. "Brenda," he said, his voice level, "we need to talk about our future. Seriously." She looked up, a familiar smirk playing on her lips. "Frank, darling, don't be so dramatic. What future? We have one. You're still young, you need a reliable man." She waved her hand dismissively, returning her attention to her screen. Her disdain, so casual, so ingrained, fueled his resolve to its breaking point. He said nothing more. He walked away, leaving her to her phone and her self-deception. The final pieces of his plan were in place. He had gathered all the evidence of Brenda's infidelity, the detailed logs of her spending, the documentation of Chad Carlson's professional failings. He had his lawyer ready, his daughters braced, and his own resolve colder and harder than steel. He was ready to strike. The knock on the door came on a Tuesday morning, just after Brenda had returned from her usual coffee date. The process server, a young man in a dark suit, handed her the thick envelope. Frank watched from his car across the street as Brenda's casual smile dissolved, replaced by a look of confusion, then outright shock. The hammer had fallen. Inside the envelope were the divorce papers meticulously drafted by Sarah Jensen. The terms were precise, surgical in their intent. They outlined Brenda's lack of financial contribution to their significant marital assets, particularly in light of Frank's substantial earnings and the secret fund he had so carefully protected. The papers also contained careful, undeniable references to her infidelities, presented as a pattern of behavior rather than isolated incidents. It was a case designed to leave her cornered, with little room to maneuver. News of the divorce spread quickly through their community, amplified by the ongoing professional troubles at Carlson Industries. The scandal was multifaceted, ensnaring both Brenda and Chad Carlson in its web. The whispers turned to open discussions, the knowing glances into outright judgment. Frank's carefully compiled evidence of Brenda's affairs, presented as a series of documented dates, times, and observations, began to circulate, eroding her social standing. The perception of her, once seen as the vivacious, charming wife of a successful engineer, evolved dramatically. At Carlson Industries, Chad Carlson found himself in the crosshairs. The significant losses incurred by the company, directly linked to projects Frank had subtly undermined, led to an internal investigation. Frank's strategic maneuvers, his quiet sabotaging of key bids, now bore fruit. Chad's professional reputation, already tarnished, was now in tatters. The possibility of him being ousted from his uncle's company, a prospect once unthinkable, became very real. Frank felt no joy in this, only the cold satisfaction of a plan executed. Brenda, reeling from the initial shock, tried to rally her usual support system. She called her sisters, Martha and Darlene, demanding their outrage. She sought solace from her friend, Shelley Peterson, spinning tales of Frank's sudden midlife crisis. But the support was lukewarm. As Frank's evidence mounted, undeniable and meticulously presented, their usual blind loyalty wavered. Martha and Darlene, remembering their own mother's struggles, found it harder to dismiss Frank's claims. Shelley, seeing Brenda's increasingly frantic and isolated state, began to distance herself, uncomfortable with the mess. Frank made sure Laura and Grace were shielded. He provided them with their own legal counsel, ensuring their interests were protected and that they understood their rights. He offered them an unwavering emotional anchor, spending even more time with them at his new home, reinforcing the stable environment he had painstakingly created. He did not badmouth Brenda directly to them, letting her own actions and the presented evidence speak for themselves. Their quiet support, their unspoken understanding, meant everything to him. The financial fallout for Brenda was significant. The details of the divorce settlement, based on Frank's exhaustive documentation and her own demonstrable lack of contribution, meant a far less comfortable future than she had ever envisioned. The carefully protected secret fund, the assets he had hidden away, now revealed, painted a clear picture of her financial vulnerability. For the first time, she truly grasped the extent of Frank's meticulous planning, the years of quiet preparation she had so blithely ignored. Brenda called them, her voice raw with a fury he hadn't heard before, a stark contrast to her usual dismissive tone. "You set me up, Frank," she screamed, the words spitting venom. "You betrayed me. I can't believe you would do this." Her anger was genuine, her sense of betrayal profound. She finally understood. She had underestimated him, not just mildly, but entirely. She had seen him as meek, as compliant, never as the architect of his own quiet retribution. Frank listened to her tirade, his phone held slightly away from his ear. He said nothing, offering no defense, no explanation. He maintained a stoic, detached demeanor throughout the proceedings, through the phone calls, through the lawyers' meetings. He let the legal system and the mountain of evidence he had accumulated speak for themselves. His silence was his strength, his calm exterior a shield against the chaos he had unleashed. The final gavel fell with a muted thud. The divorce was finalized. Frank sat upright, his lawyer Sarah Jensen beside him, her expression one of quiet satisfaction. The settlement, meticulously orchestrated, ensured Frank retained the bulk of his assets, particularly the funds he had so carefully shielded. More importantly, it established a framework that protected Laura and Grace's future, their educational trusts and well-being secured. Brenda, pale and visibly shaken, stumbled out of the courtroom, her face etched with a mix of fury and disbelief. Brenda's financial standing was dramatically reduced. Stripped of the lavish lifestyle she had taken for granted, she was left with a fraction of what she had expected, a bitter consequence of her lack of financial contribution and the compelling evidence of her infidelity. Her once vibrant social circle had dwindled to almost nothing. The casual friends who had once flocked to her side now avoided her calls, uncomfortable with the scandal and the undeniable truth of Frank's claims. She was left isolated, a prisoner of her own choices. Chad Carlson's reckoning was equally severe. The internal investigation at Carlson Industries concluded swiftly, fueled by the evidence of his professional incompetence and the devastating financial losses attributed to his mismanagement. He was publicly disgraced, stripped of his position, and his reputation in the industry was ruined. Frank heard through the grapevine that Chad had left town, a bitter exit from the comfortable life he'd once enjoyed under his uncle's wing. Justice, in its own cold corporate way, had been served. Frank, now free, found a quiet peace settling over him. He focused on his successful career at Midwest Innovations, a place where his talent and integrity were genuinely valued. The work was demanding, but it was honest, and it built something tangible. His relationship with Laura and Grace, forged in the crucible of his meticulous plan, emerged stronger than ever. They spent weekends at his new house, a comfortable, unassuming place that felt more like home than the grander house he had shared with Brenda. His daughters, though pained by the divorce, had watched their father's quiet strength unfold. They saw the methodical way he had handled everything, the quiet dignity he had maintained. They expressed a deep sense of pride and respect for his resilience, understanding now the difficult moral choices he had made. "You did the right thing, Dad," Laura told him one evening, her hand resting on his arm. Grace, as always, simply nodded, her eyes conveying a profound understanding. Frank often found himself reflecting on the decade-long journey, the slow, agonizing realization of Brenda's infidelity, and the cold, precise planning that followed. The pay the price wasn't just a phrase, it was a reality, a tangible consequence for betrayal. He wrestled with the moral complexities of his revenge. Was it right? Was it just? He acknowledged the deep, searing pain he had endured, the years of silent suffering. But he found solace, a quiet, steady warmth, in the justice he had ultimately achieved. Not just for himself, but for his daughters, for the principle of honesty and respect he had tried, however imperfectly, to uphold. He embraced his new life, shedding the shadow of Brenda's manipulation, leaving behind the meekness that had defined so much of his past. The affair's story, he knew, had brought great sorrow, a deep wound that would likely never fully heal. Yet his steadfast determination, his refusal to be diminished, had led him to a better, more authentic existence. He had found his voice, not in anger, but in action, in meticulous planning, in quiet, unwavering resolve. Frank looked forward to a future built on honesty and earned respect. The bitterness of the past would always be a part of him, a scar, a lesson learned, but it no longer defined him. He had walked through fire, and he had emerged, not unscathed, but stronger, clearer, finally at peace.